Hello and welcome back to Bookish and welcome back to my series on Where Not to Start. This is Cormac McCarthy, Where Not to Start. So I saw that Jack the Rambling Raconteur had just posted this morning, right before I started filming my video, his video on Where Not to Start with the work of James Ellroy. I'll leave a link to that down below and maybe put it in the end cards at the end if Jack allows that kind of thing. I thought it was really good. James Ellroy is an author I've never read, and Jack's video is really helpful. And as Jack pointed out in his video, kind of the point of this series of videos that I've been doing and that he's doing is to kind of get you started in maybe the best place or better, since that's harder to define, to, in our opinion, help you avoid starting in bad places with these authors. And so Cormac McCarthy is the author I chose to do for this month, in part because next month is Faulkner in August, and McCarthy has been compared to Faulkner and, inspired by Faulkner at some points in his career, so it seemed kind of appropriate to do McCarthy this month, and in part because it's been a really long time since Cormac McCarthy published a book, and I think he's kind of fallen into that level of authors who, are kind of from the recent past who people find intriguing because they know they had big hits with books and with movie adaptations and things like that, and in part because I think Cormac McCarthy is one of those authors where it's really easy to go wrong fast. So one of the things I thought was interesting about Jack's video is that he basically suggested that you not read some of James Ellroy's novels at all. And I'm tempted to do the same thing, but I'm not going to do that. I will say that I think I will say that McCarthy is, at the very least, an author who you could probably avoid or choose to skip reading all of their novels, as I have. I haven't read two of McCarthy's novels, The Orchard Keeper and Child of God. And I do know something about Child of God, so I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I have read the rest, and I guess I feel like that makes me expert enough to give you some suggestions about where not to start. So my number one place where not to start with Cormac McCarthy is with his novel Cities of the Plain. Now, Cities of the Plain is volume 3 or book 3 in what's known as McCarthy's Border Trilogy. That Border Trilogy is made up of All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, and Cities of the Plain. Well, since Cities of the Plain is book number 3, obviously you want to kind of recognize that it is the book at the end of a series and therefore not the best place to start. But confusingly, All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing, the first two novels in the Border Trilogy series, really don't have anything to do with one another, other than they involve characters crossing the border from either Texas or New Mexico or Arizona into Mexico and having a series of really difficult adventures would be a wrong way to put it. But in Cities of the Plain, those two characters do actually kind of both exist in that novel, and therefore having read the two previous, I think, is kind of a prerequisite to reading Cities of the Plain. So book number 2, I would say, is a bad place to start, is with McCarthy's, I believe, second novel, Outer Dark. Now, to be honest with you, I just read Outer Dark so I could make this video because I hadn't read any of McCarthy's first 3 novels. And I chose Outer Dark because I hadn't heard much about The Orchard Keeper, and Child of God is about a necrophiliac serial killer. And if you want to save yourself the time and displeasure of reading a whole book about that, there's a movie called, I think, The Devil All the Time, which covers a lot of the same ground as McCarthy's novel apparently does. But I did read Outer Dark, and I'll be honest with you, it wasn't really until I read Outer Dark, which was really just yesterday, that I saw the connection really between McCarthy and Faulkner. Because there are Faulkner elements to this novel. But really what I think, and one reason why I would avoid Outer Dark as a McCarthy, or as a place to start with McCarthy, is because it's really not a very good book. It does a pretty good job for 100 to 150 pages of stringing together a kind of an interesting narrative, which becomes increasingly, in which the characters experience increasingly kind of surreal things as they wander through Appalachia and encounter all kinds of people. But then it just ends badly. The ending feels rushed. The ending doesn't make any sense. The events that are taking place by the end of the book are not really well explained. It's just It's just bad. The only really interesting thing I think about Outer Dark is if you've read McCarthy's other works, you can go back and read it and see, oh, well, here's an element of The Road that's in Outer Dark, and here's an element of Blood Meridian that's contained in Outer Dark. And you can kind of see McCarthy kind of working on some of his themes, his ideas, the way he describes things that will repeat in other books. But I would not start here. I don't think it's a difficult book to read. I don't think it's a particularly deep book in terms of ideas. It's not particularly difficult in terms of its language, and even its depictions of violence for McCarthy are somewhat toned down and not fully developed, as they will be later on in his books, but not a place where I would start. In the third book, which I would tell you is not the place not to start with Cormac McCarthy, is the novel Sutri. Sutri is kind of, I think, McCarthy's most autobiographical novel. He wrote it based on his own experiences after his first divorce when he went to live in Knoxville, Tennessee. And his main character, who I think is a stand-in for himself, though I'm not saying the novel is strictly autobiographical like, autofiction is. His main character chooses to live among kind of the down and out and to associate with people on the fringes of society, the poor, the homeless, the drunk, the drug addicts, the prostitutes, the weird, the voodoo practitioners, even though his main character comes from relatively wealthy background. Sutri, I think, is not a terrible book, and I'm not saying, once you've read McCarthy and kind of gotten what McCarthy's all about, if you want to read a book which is kind of very different from a lot of McCarthy's other books, then Sutri is the book to read. It really kind of sticks out in terms of the other books of his that I've read and being somewhat unusual in being set kind of with less of the surreal kind of strangeness happening. To me, Sutri feels influenced by Orwell's Down and Out in London and Paris, and by John Steinbeck's books, Tortilla Flats and Cannery Row. I think there's some hints of that, as well as Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and some of the other beatnik writers, I think, have some influence over Sutri. But Sutri is atypical, and that's why I would tell you not to start there. If you read that book, you're going to get an impression of McCarthy that really doesn't carry over into his other books. On top of that, of all of McCarthy's books, I think Sutri is the most misogynist of his novels. So those are the three places where I would not start. And as I always do in these videos, I also give you some places to start. And I try to give you places to start based on, to a certain extent, how interested you are in McCarthy. And, whether or not you think McCarthy might be someone you want to read more than one book by. So this is just, these recommendations are related to that idea. So if you just want to read the easiest Cormac McCarthy book you can read, that is fast-paced and will feel like you're reading a movie script, because you kind of are, and will give you at least a taste of some of McCarthy's themes and his writing style, the book for you is No Country for Old Men. It's not a particularly good novel compared to his other books, which at least I think attempt oftentimes to use the P word pretentiously, to have a theme and a meaning and aspire to art. I don't think No Country for Old Men does that at all. It began as a movie script, which he then converted into a novel. But if you read it, it is fast-paced. It's an easy read. You'll kind of pick up on McCarthy's fascination with describing acts of violence as florid, and I think from his point of view, he believes as graceful and a beautiful way as possible. You'll pick up on his themes about civilization, and the degradation of humanity. All that stuff is there, and so you can get that from that book. So if you just want to read a Cormac McCarthy book fast, just to get a little taste, I think No Country for Old Men is a good place to start. If you want to read Cormac McCarthy's best book, and what I consider to be a true masterpiece of American literature, then Blood Meridian is the place to start. The book is difficult in all kinds of ways. The language and the descriptiveness is difficult. This is where I think you see McCarthy's refusal to use quotation marks at its most confusing. It is definitely a book with a theme, an idea, a message, and that message is not particularly clear. And on top of that, I think it's McCarthy's most violent book, with violence described in very gruesome detail. Additionally, it is McCarthy's, of the books I've read, his most surreal book, where the line between real and fantasy, fantasy being kind of the wrong word, is somewhat blurred. But I do think it isn't actually a masterpiece. I know Steve Donahue would disagree with that and would disagree with all my assessments of McCarthy, but I do think it's a great book. That's his best book. If you want to read McCarthy's most popular book, and the book you're most likely to find other people to read, then the book for you is The Road, his post-apocalyptic story of a journey of a father and his son who are escaping some kind of an apocalypse, an attempt to get to a place where civilization still remains, and they have to avoid all kinds of cannibals and violence and pitfalls and disease and hunger, etc. And maybe this is the most violent of McCarthy's books now that I think about it. It is very grim. It's not a difficult read. You can read it quickly. You get the elements of McCarthy's writing and his overwriting, and sometimes I think the descriptions in that book are beautiful, and sometimes I think they are overwrought and overdone. But that is the book I think that you are most likely to find that other readers have read of Cormac McCarthy's. The best place to start, I think, is with the first book in the Border trilogy, All the Pretty Horses. This is, I think, McCarthy at his most contained in terms of writing a readable story. Unlike most of his novels, there's actually a female character who you understand her motivation and you can see inside her mind and her thoughts. I think that's unusual, but it's still also an interesting kind of adventure story of a young man who crosses the border into Mexico with a friend and gets into all kinds of trouble and fights and prison, and there's violence. There's unrequited love, even though there's romance. There's all kinds of stuff in it. It was made into a movie too, and I think it's a good book. I don't think it's like a literary masterpiece, but I think it's a very good book, and for me, that's the place to start. Anyway, there you go. There's my opinion about where not to start with Cormac McCarthy's work, and then some advice, perhaps, depending on what you're interested in terms of reading, or why you're thinking about reading Cormac McCarthy. Some places to start. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and as always, thank you for watching.